Well, good morning. It sure is good to see everybody on this wonderfully brisk March Sunday. Happy to be together this morning to study the Bible. We'll be in John chapter 7 and a little bit in John chapter 8 today. Probably just parking there for most of this class as we continue our study through the life of Christ. This is the second quarter in the life of Christ. We've got one more to go. We're past the halfway point of his earthly ministry. We are just concluding what's known as the periods of retirement after his great Galilean ministry. Then he spends a good bit of time just kind of getting off with his apostles at times, to be alone with them and work with them, although the crowds often follow, as we've noticed. And this morning's lesson will be, as I said, in John chapter 7. And it's an event that occurs in Jerusalem, the Feast of the Tabernacles, in which Jesus attends, and there's a lot of interaction between himself, the people, and the leaders, and it's just, I think, a fascinating chapter. It is not one that we study very often, very deeply. It is a little bit confusing, frankly, to read through it. There's a lot of dialogue, a lot of back and forth. Looks like there's not any progress being made in believing in Jesus at times. But it's a really important chapter in the Gospel of John, and I think in the life of Christ. And I'll explain why I think that in just a bit. So this is the last thing we looked at in our last class period. Jesus heading down to Jerusalem. His unbelieving brothers kind of goad him into openly attending the Feast of the Tabernacles, although he does attend in the middle of the feast, but he doesn't go with them. He's doing things at this point in his life, and really all the way throughout, on a timetable. God had planned from before the foundation of the world that Jesus was going to die on the cross, and I think he was going to die on the cross at the Passover, probably from the time that God instituted the Passover, if not before then. God had all this laid out in his great wisdom in mind before the world began, and there is a timetable to be followed, I believe, in all of this. But Jesus leaves later than his brothers want, and he goes down through Samaria to Jerusalem to this Feast of the Tabernacles. So let's talk about the Feast of the Tabernacles for a minute. It's one of the main required feasts for Jewish men, that they make a pilgrimage to the temple if possible, to the sanctuary. Set up in Leviticus chapter 23 and mentioned elsewhere, Leviticus 23 and verse 24. God tells Moses to speak to the children of Israel, saying, "The 15th day of this 7th month shall be the Feast of the Tabernacles for 7 days to the Lord. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation," that's an assembly. He says, "You shall do no customary work on it. For 7 days you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. On the 8th day you shall have a holy convocation, and you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. It is a sacred assembly. You shall do no customary work." So a sacred assembly, one of the great important feasts, and it accomplishes a couple of things. It's the latter harvest is occurring at this time, but it's not mainly a feast of the harvest so much as a feast of tabernacles or booths that they were to make and dwell in during this time period, reminiscent or memorializing what? What were they supposed to remember? Wandering in the wilderness, when they had to dwell in tents. And so this helps them remember, as the Passover memorialized their deliverance from Egypt. This is the time of wilderness wandering when God was leading them through the wilderness, through the promised land, and it memorializes that. It's supposed to be a feast of celebration. It's not in some ways as serious and somber as the Passover, but it is, as we said, significant. It is still celebrated today by observant Jews throughout the world. Interesting practices, of course, and some of them hark back all the way to the Old Testament. Some of them are sort of newer traditions that the Jews have instituted. You see in these pictures, this is an apartment complex, and these people have built little houses, dwellings outside of their apartment complexes so they can be in those during the tabernacles. You see the same thing here. You see somebody here with off the top of his balcony in an apartment, he's built some kind of a shed thingy to celebrate the Feast of the Tabernacle. So it's an interesting kind of feast. There, as I said, there are traditions and meals and things that go with it nowadays. It's on the 15th day of month of Tishri in the Hebrew calendar, which obviously differs from ours. It's more of a lunar calendar, but it's typically sometime from September to late October. In 2024, it was celebrated from October 16th to October 23rd. So that's kind of a typical time frame for it. So it's in the fall sometime when it's celebrated. And that helps us as far as a timeline goes to understand where we're in Jesus' ministry and his life. So if this is, say, October, the fall, he's going to be crucified and raised during what feast? Passover, okay, which is when? Spring, same time as, people in America celebrate Easter. That's when that is. So you have from the fall, the Feast of the Tabernacles. John in his gospel will mention one more feast that Jesus is at in John chapter 10, the Feast of Dedication. We call that Hanukkah today. That's usually sometime in December. So we have markers of these feasts. So this is the last 6 months of Jesus' life. And I might say that this feast that he attends is truly a turning point, because here he is in Jerusalem. His ministry and his person and the problems that the Jewish leaders are having with him really come to a head, come to the full attention of the Sanhedrin Council during this feast. He is purposely, I think, pressing a button that has not been pressed to this point, where he is kind of forcing the issue upon the leaders. They've been aware of him, they've been contradicting him and opposing him all the way up in Galilee up until this point. But he hasn't, to this point, brought it to their front door in the way that he does during the Feast of the Tabernacles. And they see very clearly that they've got a problem with the multitudes, with the common Jewish people, with the tens of thousands of people that attend these feasts. They've got a problem controlling them, getting them to stay adherent to their traditions. That I'm talking about the leaders of the Jews. And so a lot of it comes to a head here, and it changes the way Jesus works from here on out, and frankly the threats that he's going to encounter. So we open up in John chapter 7 and verse 1. After these things, Jesus walked in Galilee. He did not want to walk in Jerusalem because the Jews sought to kill him. So he's staying away from that until a time that he deems to be proper, which is going to be during the Feast of the Tabernacles here. The Jews' Feast of the Tabernacles is at hand, it says in verse 2. His brothers say to him, "Depart from here, go to Judea. Your disciples also may see the works that you are doing. No one does anything in secret while he himself seeks to be made known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." And then John says, "For even his brothers did not believe in him." So his physical brothers pressuring him to go down. They're not in control of his ministry, though. He's listening to his Father in heaven. He's doing things the way the Father wants them done. And he basically says that to them. My time isn't right now. You go on and go. It's not really any of your business, kind of a thing. And I've got things I know what I'm doing, in essence. At this point, John notes there in verse 5 that his brothers didn't even believe in him. And you say, well, how can his brothers not believe in him? How can his brothers not believe in him at this point? Right. Right.
And here he is changed when they came to kill him in Mark 3:30. He kind of says, "This is my mother, my brothers. People that are following me are my mother and brother now."
Right. So we've seen all of that in his early ministry. Him going to Nazareth, being rejected by the people. A prophet is not without honor except in his own country and among his own people, he says. So Jesus grew up with these people. Was he working miracles, when he was a little boy and all the way up till he became 30 years old or so? Was he showing his, flying around the house when he was a kid or anything like that? No, he wasn't doing anything like that. He doesn't seem to do any miracles until after his baptism, and then he enters his public ministry. So people that knew him best growing up were thinking, what in the world? Of course, Mary knows what's going on, but other than that, those things were kept in her heart that she knows about. So they have trouble believing in him, but they come to believe in him. In Acts chapter 1, they're some of those who are with the ones gathered in Jerusalem along with the apostles. You might remember that. They're specifically named. And also, as you go on later in the Scriptures, it seems that one of Jesus' brothers becomes a leader in the church in Jerusalem and writes the book of James, and another brother of his, apparently we think, writes the book of Jude. So you have two of his brothers becoming significant factors in the flow of the gospel as it goes forward. But at this point, that's not the case. They're still 6 months away from his crucifixion, and they're not on board with his ministry. Well, Jesus, oh, wow, sorry. I did the thing with the button again. I got to watch that. Jesus declines to go with his brothers. His hour had not yet fully come, so he remains in Galilee, as I said, and after his brothers go, then he goes up to the feast in secret, is what we have starting down through verse 10. So he gets there, and we're going to pick up in verse 11. The Jews sought him at the feast and said, "Where is he?" There was much complaining among the people concerning him. Some said he's good, others said no. On the contrary, he deceives the people. However, no one spoke openly of him for fear of the Jews. So in this chapter especially, but really throughout the Gospel of John, you have John referring to people as the Jews. Who are the Jews, especially in the Gospel of John? Who's he talking about? The Pharisees, the leaders of the Jews, primarily those who would be on the Sanhedrin Council. Sometimes that would include Sadducees, Pharisees, chief priests, the leaders of the Jews. But when he uses the term the Jews, it's almost always in the Gospel of John, almost always a reference to those leaders. You have, in contrast to the Jews, you have the crowd or the people. Now, who are they going to be at the Feast of the Tabernacles? The crowd or the people. Who are they going to be? They're people who've come to the feast. Some of them are going to be dwellers of Jerusalem who live here all the time and kind of know what's going on in that area. Some of them are going to be from out of town and got no idea what's going on. Some of them are going to be people that Jesus has interacted with in his great ministry in Galilee. They've seen miracles and they've talked about them, and maybe they've gone, we're among the 5,000, the 4,000 that got fed by Jesus miraculously. So you have just all sorts of people at this feast, probably close to 200,000 people, the estimates would be, at this feast, maybe more, just all compressed into Jerusalem. A lot of information, a lot of disinformation, a lot of opinions. So what you have to do to keep from total confusion when you go through chapter 7 is make sure you know who's speaking, who's being talked about. When you get a reaction, when you read somebody's reaction, who is it that's reacting here? Because in a second you'll see somebody else say something opposite. Somebody from Jerusalem might say something different from somebody in the crowd who just showed up in town this week. The leaders are going to say different things than the soldiers, for instance. So you have a whole lot of varying opinions. And believing in Jesus becomes a flashpoint of controversy in John chapter 7. That's the point. Believing in Jesus becomes a flashpoint of controversy. We are used to those in America, right? Just anything happens politically, we automatically have a flashpoint of controversy. Well, that's what this became. And remained that way all the way through the crucifixion of Christ. Well, Jesus makes his appearance in verse 14, starting there. Nobody's wanting to speak about Jesus because of the fear of the Jews. There are a lot of opinions being whispered about, but nobody's wanting to talk about him because of fear of the Jewish leaders. But in verse 14, in the middle of the feast, so it's how long's the feast? What did we decide in Leviticus? 8 days, really. There's 7 days, and then the 8th day is a special convocation. So it's an 8-day feast, so this is maybe day 4 or 5. Middle of the feast, Jesus goes into the temple and teaches. So he appears right there. The Jews, they are the Jewish leaders, marveled, saying, "How does this man know letters, having never studied?" So that's impressive to them. They take note of that. Jesus answered and said, "My doctrine is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone wills to do his will, he shall know concerning the doctrine, whether it's from God or whether I speak on my own authority. He who speaks from himself seeks his own glory, but he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him is true, and no unrighteousness is in him." So the Jews marvel, how does this man know his letters? And Jesus explains that if you want to know where I'm getting my information from, if you want to know where this is coming from, anyone who wants to do God's will, you'll know. If you want to do God's will, you examine my speech, and you'll find out that it's from God. It's from heaven. That's what he's saying. Is the true source of his teaching is heavenly. If he were speaking from himself, he would be seeking his own glory, but he's not seeking his own glory. He's seeking God's glory. And then he says, you know what? Moses has given you the law. And instead of adhering to that, which among other things says you shall not kill, they were seeking to kill Jesus. So here they had received a message from God, from heaven, through Moses, which says don't kill, and they're wanting to kill Jesus. Well, there's confusion about that statement, which is made in verse 19. Notice in verse 20, the people answered and said, you have a demon who is seeking to kill you. Why would they say that? Who's talking now? The people. The people from where? Probably the people from out of town, right? Because they don't know what's going on. The rulers have confided among themselves they'd like to kill Jesus. They've already plotted to do that multiple times. But here are people who don't know what's going on, so to them, Jesus appears crazy. You have a demon. You're crazy. Who's trying to kill you? Nobody's trying to kill you. So they think he's just out there somewhere by making such a statement. But Jesus goes on and says, you know what? You Jews, you'll circumcise someone on the Sabbath in order to keep the law. Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath, and they wanted to kill him. Now, in the Gospel of John, that probably references John 5. Jesus had been in Jerusalem earlier. One of the times he was ministering in Galilee, but he'd come down to Jerusalem. There was, at the pool of Bethesda, that lame man, and Jesus healed him, remember, on the Sabbath day. John 5 then becomes this big controversy just among the leaders of the Jews and Jesus, as he talks about his identity as being the Son of God and presents evidence for that he had a right as God to heal on the Sabbath. But they wouldn't accept all of that. So you get to through those verses from verse 20 through about 24, and verse 23, he says, if a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath, so that the law of Moses should not be broken, are you angry with me because I made a man completely well on the Sabbath? They're getting on him for working divine work, doing the work of God as God on the Sabbath day, when they don't mind circumcising somebody on the Sabbath. That would involve some work. They don't mind doing that just to keep the law of Moses. And then Jesus says, I think in this context, something you can really see the import of it. He says, do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. Don't just look at something and jump to a conclusion and say, no, that can't be right. Or no, that's blasphemy. Or no, don't just look at the outward of anything. We need to learn this lesson in our culture right now, for sure. People just jump into conclusions about anything and everything, and the actual amount of knowledge that we typically have about what's going on, you can fill a thimble with it maybe, but it's just not that much. And we jump to these conclusions, we jump down one another's throats about everything, and that's kind of what's going on here. Jesus is saying, don't do that. Don't. Oh yeah, the bigger the mob, the easier that is to do, and the more, it's that kind of mentality. So, yeah.
I was thinking, early in the book of Acts, council, captain of the people, they arrest the apostle, threaten them. Stephen says to the high priest and the others, you're not keeping the law, you killed the just. I'm wondering if some of these same people that Jesus is telling, you're not keeping the law, you're going to kill them. Same ones maybe that Stephen.
100%. They would have had to be. The same people that Jesus is talking to here are the same people that Stephen was talking to. It wasn't all that much later that happened, less than a year, that probably would have happened. So, exactly so. Going forward, some really interesting things happen when you see how people come to belief in Jesus. You see some reasons that people reject belief in him. And that's all in plain view. John's writing to get us to believe. That's all, his gospel is all about that. But he's very honest about people rejecting Jesus, not coming to believe in him, and why they did that. Things people said, things people thought to come to their conclusions about Jesus. And you have a lot of that in these next few verses, starting in verse 25. Some of them from Jerusalem said, "Is this not he whom they seek to kill?" See the difference in these people and the general people? These people know that the leaders, they're from Jerusalem. They've been in town. They've heard the rumors about what the leaders are trying to do. Is this not he whom they seek? See, the people, other people said, "Well, who's seeking to kill you?" These people say, "Oh yeah, this is the one who they say they're seeking to kill," but they're not grabbing him. They're not arresting him. They're not killing him. So they say, "Look, he speaks boldly," and they say nothing to him. Do the rulers know indeed that this is truly the Christ? I mean, what they're saying is they were going to kill him, but they're not doing anything now. Maybe they figured out he's really the Christ. And again, rumors get started. They don't know why, but they're guessing. And that's an idea that they have. But then you go on, and they're saying more bad information. "However, we know where this man is from, but when the Christ comes, no one knows where he's from." They think they know where he's from, right? They don't know where he's from. Right? They thought he was a carpenter's son from Galilee, and this will come up again in the text here in just a second, that they don't know he's born in Bethlehem. That's what they expect. So there's misinformation that's guiding their decision-making and their thinking about Jesus. Jesus declares then that they actually do know where he's from. He's from God. He's been saying this. You go back through John, he's repeatedly said this. "I'm from heaven, I'm from God," John 5. Repeatedly says these kinds of things throughout the Gospel of John especially. And he says it again here. You know where I'm from. Just wake up, pay attention. I'm telling you where I'm from. I'm showing you where I'm from by the miracles that I'm performing. There were some who tried to take him as a result of that, so there were people who are against him. They sought to take him, but no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. What do we say about timetable? When's this going to happen? When the hour comes, when the time's right. Now, he's going to be crucified as the Passover lamb when the Passover lambs are being killed, literally. And all that's going to happen in its time. But many of the people, on the other hand, believed in him. A lot of people believe in him because what they're thinking is when the Christ comes, will he do more signs than what this man's done? They've seen the miracles. Some that he did in Jerusalem, a lot that he did in Galilee. Some of these people had seen those. They're thinking, this has got to be him. How could it not be? So you see the vast difference of opinions that people have. Is that like today? And the reasons that we have vast differences of opinions are exactly the same. We don't have all the information. We have some information that is wrong. We have some that is right, that contradicts other information. We're being told by religious leaders one thing when we see with Scripture something else, and on and on and on you go. All of the things that are at work here causing confusion, both to the extent of belief and unbelief and everything in between, we have active today. And you wonder why people believe so many different things. Same elements that were affecting them affect us. The Pharisees, Freddie, you're so right. That's my point. We'd be right in the middle of all this. Exactly. If we were experiencing, just put ourselves there and choose where you want to be. You want to be growing up in Jerusalem. You want to come from Galilee. You want to be one of the leaders of the Jews. Much of our thinking would be driven. And there are very few exceptions to this, but we're going to see one in this story if we get there. Nicodemus is a leader of the Jews who's able to filter through all of this erroneous information and understand who Jesus is. So you could still do that, but by and large, the average person is just confused in John chapter 7. So the Pharisees send officers to arrest Jesus. Jesus continues teaching. He says, I'm going to be with you a little while longer, and then I'm going to return to the one who sent me, and you're not going to be able to follow me. So when he says that, the Jews wonder, well, okay, he's going to try to escape us. He's kind of going to try to get out of town and, be on the lam or whatever. He's going to hide from us by going to the dispersion, maybe teaching the Greeks. And I think they're not thinking actual Gentiles, that they think he might go to Jews that are dispersed in the Grecian society. But in any case, they think he's going to get out of town and hide from them so they can't arrest him. That's the thinking. Well, on the last day of the feast, which is the 8th day, and it's the big convocation, everybody's supposed to be there, the big crowds, Jesus starts talking about what he's offering. On the last day, verse 37, Jesus stood and cried out, saying, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the Scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of water." He's talking about the Holy Spirit that would be given to those who believe in him. He's making this grand offer, as he did to the woman at the well in John 4 earlier, of life everlasting through the Spirit of God. The people then are greatly divided. People are greatly divided. And there's a good bit of controversy that ensues as a result of that. Obviously, has been going on all the way through this. I'll try to go back forward again. Some from the crowd say, truly, this is the prophet. Others say, this is the Christ. Now, notice this division. This is the prophet. This is the Christ. They're disagreeing with one another, they think. So Moses had prophesied in Deuteronomy 18 that there would be a prophet to come who would give the law, and everybody had to listen to him. They were waiting for that prophet. The Christ, the Messiah, prophesied by Daniel, David, and others, the anointed king to come, they think is a different person. So they have one set of, the prophet's coming, they have another set, the Christ is coming. What they don't know is what? Same person. But they're arguing with one another whether it's the prophet or the Christ. No, it's the Christ, it's the prophet. See, so some are definitely come to believe in him. Then some ask, will the Christ come out of Galilee? Because what they think they know is he's from Galilee. They think they know that. Isn't he supposed to come from Bethlehem where David was? And see, that's a hang-up for them because of what? They lack in knowledge. They lack true information. You think people today sometimes have hang-ups and don't believe in Jesus because they don't really have all the facts? Yeah. Same problems. Some want to arrest Jesus, but again, no one lays a hand on him. We continue on, and the officers return to the Pharisees empty-handed. The Pharisees say, "Why haven't you brought him? No man ever spoke like this." I mean, they couldn't handle it. Here are trained officers, and these would be the temple police, basically. And they encountered a lot of folks, but they never encountered anybody like Jesus. The Pharisees said, "Are you also deceived? Have any of the rulers or the Pharisees believed in him?" What's the assumption of most of the leaders? None of us have believed in him. None of the leaders believe in him. Are they right about that? Again, wrong information. They don't know. There's actually a number of, John will tell us in John 12, many of them believed in Jesus, but they wouldn't confess it lest they be kicked out of the synagogue. Here, we know, go ahead, yeah, Doug. Oh, yeah. They'd love that. Yeah, there's no doubt that their pride is involved. Yeah, and it's contrary to their agenda, exactly, both of those things. So, Nicodemus does speak up. This is the second time we've seen Nicodemus. Of course, in John chapter 3, he came to Jesus by night. That's mentioned. He's the one that came to him by night. But Nicodemus is sitting on the Sanhedrin council. He's a Pharisee, one of them. He's plainly a secret disciple at this point. They don't realize where he stands. Does our law judge a man before it hears him and knows what he's doing? Now, that's a reasonable question. We haven't really examined him. We haven't heard from him. They answered and said to him, "Are you also from Galilee? Search and look, for no prophet has arisen out of Galilee." Again, is that true? Any prophets come from Galilee? And it's very likely that Nahum did. Capernaum means village of Nahum. Very likely, traditionally, that he came. But we know that Jonah, who's from Gath-hepher, is from there. And possibly other prophets as well. So they don't even know their own law. Isaiah had prophesied that the Messiah would come and minister in Galilee. Specifically mentions Galilee in Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. The great light would shine there. So again, these people are supposed to be leaders. They don't know what they're talking about all the way through this, as a lot of religious leaders today don't. Same thing. And that's hindering people from believing in Jesus. One of the things I'm don't let me go too far off on this, but I just want to tell you, so many times when people come to me with questions or we have discussions and Bible classes I'm having with young people, and I'll hear something and it's something a lot of people believe. My preacher said this, or this. What about this? What about this? And I'll just say, they made that up. They just made it up. It is not in the Bible. Show me where it is in the Bible. Anything like that. And a lot of things that are accepted as fact by religious leaders today you can't find anything like it in the Bible. It's not a 30-second cousin to anything that's in the Bible. It's just made up stuff. Just like these people, they were just saying stuff. And you still have that today. All right. Well, at the end of this, everybody goes home, and Jesus has brought this woman that's caught in the act of adultery. If we follow John's timeline and put this event, it's very likely that Jesus stayed in Jerusalem after the Feast of the Tabernacles, and so there's a bit of an aftermath here, and he's keeping on. He's still coming in the temple maybe the next day and interacting with people who still want to talk to him. So it seems to me to be very likely that the Jewish leaders are now trying to find something they can catch him with, where the crowd would be on their side and they could take him and do what they wanted to with him. So the scribes and the Pharisees bring him this woman that's caught in adultery in the very act. I will say, maybe just in brief here, we don't have time to delve into it, some of your Bibles will have this section footnoted, that it's not in the original text. There is a manuscript problem with it. A lot of the older manuscripts that we have do not have this in it. And I don't have time to get into all the whys and wherefores. It is in the Latin Vulgate, and Jerome translated that in about 400 AD, and he was working from texts much more ancient than then to put the Vulgate together. It is in a lot of other manuscripts. And so that's a scholarly debate about whether or not it should be placed here or not. My opinion would be probably so, and that it certainly is a very Jesus-like story. It's much in line with what John is saying and what's happening in this context. So I think it does flow with the context. I think it probably does belong there, but it's an argument for another day, another time. In any case, they bring this woman. She's caught in the very act of adultery. What does the law say to do to such a person? Stone her, just her, right? The man and the woman. And the way you do that is you catch him and then you bring him to the local prophet or the local rabbi and say, "Are we supposed to stone her or not?" Is that how you do it? No. You take her to the elders. Take them both to the elders of the city or whoever's doing justice in that city, and give your accusations and your proof and your evidence with the witnesses, and then a sentence is given and they're both stoned. Is that what these guys are doing? No. So they catch just the woman, because women don't have any rights, but men do in Jewish culture. And the woman she couldn't object to this. She couldn't appeal, whatever. She's completely powerless. The man somehow gets off, even though they're caught in the very act. So it's all obviously poorly planned and executed by the Jews. So why are they bringing her to Jesus? Yeah, they're just trying to find something they can get on him. So again, I think they're trying to sway the multitudes. Many of these crowds are believing in Jesus, and they're having a hard time with this, and they will all the way up to the day of his crucifixion. There are just a lot of people who are not on the side of the Jewish leaders here. They're trying to find an excuse to get him out of the way. Could they just... Right. Even so, they wouldn't be able to kill him, right? They couldn't execute him, but if they had the people on their side, they could accomplish something, and that's what they're trying to do. Again, the law said to stone her. The Romans say we can't stone her. And that, of course, the Jews did not have the right to execute people under their law. The Romans gave them wide latitude, but specifically during this period of time, the rule was the Jews could not execute capital punishment. One of their leaders had recently tried to do it and had done it. His name was Annas. He used to be the high priest. That's why he wasn't the high priest anymore, because he had some people executed, and the Romans set him down and said, "You're not going to be the high priest." And so his son-in-law was now the high priest, Caiaphas. And so they're trying to get around all of that, but they're trying to make it this issue. The law says we're supposed to stone her. Romans say we can't. What are we going to do here? Make it that kind of issue. And Jesus has none of it. And it's almost sadly humorous. Jesus takes a long time to answer. He writes in the ground and as if ignoring them. And then finally, when they persist, "He who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first." And one by one, starting with the oldest, each is convicted by their own conscience. They know that they've done sinful things, some of them probably worthy of death under the Old Testament law. And they go out one by one, and Jesus is left alone with the woman. Jesus does not condemn the woman. He says, "Where are your accusers? They're gone." "I'm not going to condemn you either," Jesus says. He doesn't condemn her. But interestingly, he also doesn't say, "Your sins are forgiven you." He had done that multiple times, right, with other people. Just told them their sins were forgiven. He doesn't tell her that. I think what he does maybe implies it, but he doesn't tell her that. What does he tell her? Go and sin no more. So is Jesus, well, that's one. That's okay. Don't worry about it. Is that what he's saying? No. He's acknowledging the seriousness of the sin and that she should be grateful that she's gotten out of this situation without having to give her life. And so you go and sin no more is what he tells her to do. He's showing mercy. But the main point of the lesson, again, this is very Jesus-like. It's similar to what he's done other times. But to silence his accusers and these people that are trying to stir up trouble in this way was maybe even more significant in the context of what John is telling us about. And he tells her to go and sin no more. All right, we'll pick up there, Lord willing, next class period, which is a week from today because Wednesday night is our singing. Look forward to that. Thank you for your attention and your good comments this morning.